Welcome back to the File X channel. Elizabeth Fritzl, 24 years imprisoned by her own father, subjected to abuse and rape, giving birth to 7 children. In 2008, a horrifying story shocked Austria and left the world in utter disbelief. A woman named Elizabeth Fritzl, then 42 years old, suddenly reappeared after more than 2 decades of what seemed to be complete disappearance. No one could have imagined that behind this haunting return lay an unimaginable tragedy, an unspeakable crime. She revealed to the police that, for the past 24 years, she had been cruelly imprisoned by her own father, Josef Fritzl, in a dark basement beneath their family home. Even more terrifying, during this living nightmare, she had been sexually abused over 3,000 times, subjected to relentless physical and psychological torment. From her father's depraved actions, Elizabeth was forced to bear 7 children, all of them the result of his monstrous acts of rape. Imagine this: an 18-year-old girl, vibrant and full of life, deceived by her own father and lured into a dark, cold basement. What followed was the beginning of an endless journey of pain and despair. Josef had designed the basement as a perfect prison, soundproof, completely sealed off, and without any means of escape. There, Elizabeth lived in darkness, deprived of sunlight, freedom, and even hope. For 24 long years, Josef Fritzl led a double life. Above ground, he was seen as a respectable father and husband in the eyes of neighbors. But beyond the secret door leading to the basement, he became a heartless monster, mercilessly destroying his own daughter's life. This heinous crime was only uncovered when one of the children Elizabeth had given birth to fell gravely ill and needed emergency medical attention. Her appearance at the hospital, along with her shocking testimony, finally unraveled the dark secret that had been hidden for nearly a quarter of a century. The world held its breath in horror upon learning of Josef Fritzl's atrocities. How could a person be so cruel as to imprison his own flesh and blood in a hellish dungeon for decades? Elizabeth Fritzl's story not only shook Austria to its core, but also became a wake-up call for the world. It shed light on the dark, unfathomable depths of the human soul, where the line between good and evil seems to have completely vanished. The disappearance and the farewell letter. On the morning of August 28, 1984, in what seemed like an ordinary day in a peaceful small town, Elizabeth Fritzl, an 18-year-old girl with radiant beauty, suddenly vanished without a trace. Her mother, Rose Marie, was driven nearly insane with worry. She searched everywhere, questioned every neighbor, but it was as if Elizabeth had disappeared into thin air. In utter desperation, she reported the incident to the police, clinging to the faint hope of finding some clue about her beloved daughter. But no one knew that while everyone was frantically searching for her, Elizabeth was still in her own familiar home, imprisoned in the cold darkness by a monster in the guise of her father. Weeks after Elizabeth's disappearance, the family grew increasingly horrified by the deafening silence. They began to brace themselves for the worst, until one day, an unexpected letter arrived. In it, Elizabeth's familiar handwriting declared that she had grown weary of the stifling family life and had decided to run away. The letter ended with a chilling message: "Don't look for me anymore." The family was stunned by the contents of the letter. How could Elizabeth, a gentle young girl who deeply loved her family, write such bitter words? Yet, with no other option, they were forced to believe she had truly left. But behind that letter lay a truth far more horrifying than any nightmare. The words were not Elizabeth's will. Josef Fritzl, her own father, had forced her to write them to cover up his vile actions. Holding the letter in his hand, Josef walked into the police station, his face filled with apparent sorrow, but his tone unnervingly calm. He told the police that Elizabeth might have joined a mysterious religious cult. He claimed she had vaguely mentioned it during a past conversation and explained that they had argued because he strongly opposed the idea. Josef, with his composed and trustworthy demeanor, cleverly steered all suspicions in the direction he wanted, that the young girl had left home due to emotional distress. The police, with no other evidence to go on, had no choice but to believe him. No one could have imagined that, as the letter was being analyzed, Elizabeth was already trapped underground by her own father, beginning an endless series of silent, agonizing days. The case of Elizabeth's disappearance was closed, as if swallowed by a mysterious fog. Meanwhile, beneath the house, a horrifying secret was sinking deeper into darkness, waiting for the day it would finally be uncovered. Kidnapped by her own father. On the very day Rosemarie discovered her daughter Elizabeth had gone missing, August 28, 1984, Josef had earlier called Elizabeth down to the basement under the pretense of helping him install a new door for the recently renovated space. However, Josef took advantage of her momentary distraction and quickly pressed a chloroform-soaked cloth over her mouth, causing her to lose consciousness. He then dragged her into the basement he had meticulously prepared for this moment. Josef was, in truth, a deeply disturbed individual. He had begun abusing Elizabeth when she was just 11 years old. By the time she turned 13 in 1979, he had already devised his chilling plan to kidnap her, starting with the construction of a hidden basement beneath their 3-story home. Neighbors reported hearing noises from the construction work but never questioned it, as Josef was an electrical engineer, and it was assumed to be part of his job. During this period, Josef strictly prohibited his family from approaching the basement, claiming it was his workspace. When the basement was finally completed, it was soundproofed and sealed. That day, Josef tied Elizabeth up with ropes in her new prison. On the second day, he tightened his control further by looping a noose around her waist, keeping her confined in the very room where she was imprisoned. Afterward, Josef began visiting her 3 times a week, typically during the daytime. Trapped in the basement, Elizabeth tried to think of ways to escape. She realized she would need to bypass 3 locked doors to reach freedom. However, Josef continuously warned her of the dangers lurking in the basement. He claimed it was rigged with gas traps and high-voltage electricity that would kill her if she attempted to flee. Josef even threatened that if anyone attempted to break into the basement, the gas would be released, slowly suffocating her to death. Over time, the world outside forgot about Elizabeth's disappearance. Even within her own family, the memory of her began to fade. Neither her mother, Rosemarie, nor her 6 siblings had the faintest idea of the horrifying reality taking place beneath their small family home. Elizabeth's life in captivity was a nightmare, hidden in plain sight, as the monstrous truth remained buried in the silence of the basement walls. 24 years of living in hell under the captivity of her monstrous father. To neighbors and relatives, Josef appeared to be a good father and a perfect husband. Every morning, he would wake up early and head to the basement, claiming to design machines that he would later sell. Occasionally, he even stayed overnight in the basement, but Rosemarie never suspected anything. She believed her husband was a diligent, responsible man, devoted to his family. However, to Elizabeth, Joseph was nothing short of a demon in human form. During the first year of her captivity in the dark basement, Elizabeth was kept tightly bound. After some time, she was released from her chains to acclimate to her new life and allowed to move freely within the small windowless room. It was then that Joseph began his monstrous acts. He forced Elizabeth to watch various pornographic films and proceeded to abuse her, mercilessly beating her whenever she resisted. Over the course of 24 years, Elizabeth endured unimaginable suffering, including being sexually assaulted more than 3,000 times. Giving birth to 7 children in filthy, dark conditions. In the second year of her father's abuse, Elizabeth became pregnant, but she miscarried at 10 weeks. 2 years later, in August 1988, she became pregnant again and gave birth to a baby girl named Kirsten. 2 years after that, a baby boy named Stefan was born, both in the sunless basement. Kirsten and Stefan lived with Elizabeth in the basement, surviving on the meager supplies of food and water that Joseph brought down weekly. Despite living in such a dark and horrifying environment, Elizabeth, driven by her maternal instincts, did everything she could to educate her children with the knowledge she had accumulated during her 18 years above ground. She strived to create as normal a life as possible for them and fostered a sense of family within the confines of their prison. Over the next 18 years, Elizabeth gave birth to 5 more children. Lisa, 1992. Monica, 1994. Twins, Alexander and Michael, 1996. One of the twins, Michael, was gravely ill at birth. Joseph refused to seek medical help, and the baby died after just 3 days. Joseph then incinerated the child's body in the basement furnace. Felix, 2002. During all 7 of her deliveries, Elizabeth received no medical assistance whatsoever. She gave birth in the basement on a filthy blanket, equipped only with a childbirth book Joseph had provided 2 months prior. At the last moment, she was given an additional blanket. Her only tools were scissors, a few diapers, and anti-inflammatory aspirin. Raising children in harsh conditions, suffering cruel treatment. Living conditions in the small basement were already harsh for Elizabeth, but having children there made the hardships even more glaring. There was no heating, only walls and a small window surrounding them. The space was dark, damp, and reeked of foul odors. Power outages were frequent, sometimes lasting for several hours, or even up to 10 days. Without electricity, they had no water and could not cook, relying instead on prepackaged snacks. Summers were the worst, as the heat from outside radiated down into the basement, turning it into a suffocating oven. Joseph often starved Elizabeth and cruelly mistreated the 6 children. On scraps of paper hidden in the dark basement, Elizabeth secretly recorded the days, months, and every slap, threat, or instance of Joseph smashing dishes. Separated from her children, some above ground, some below. As the children grew older and the basement became too cramped, Joseph expanded the room from 35 square meters to 55 square meters. He forced Elizabeth and her children to dig out the soil with their bare hands over the course of several years. Despite this, the space was still insufficient. One of the children began suffering from a foot infection, frequently crying loudly. Fearing that the noise might alert the neighbors, Joseph decided to bring the child above ground, integrating it into his life with Rosemary. He staged the discovery of abandoned children and coerced Elizabeth to write letters and record voice messages saying she could not care for her children and wanted her parents to raise them instead. On a night in May 1993, Joseph acted surprised when he found a cardboard box containing a sleeping baby girl placed outside the house. Alongside the box was a letter from Elizabeth, naming the baby Lisa, born in August 1992, now 6 months old, and asking her parents to take care of her. At first, Rosemarie was shocked by the child's sudden appearance, but quickly became delighted and took Lisa inside. Just over a year later, in December 1994, another baby girl was found in a stroller in the same spot. Minutes after the baby was brought inside, the phone rang. Rosemarie answered, and on the other end of the line was Elizabeth. Strangely, despite Rosemarie's flurry of questions, Elizabeth only said one sentence: "I left her there." She then hung up. Rosemarie was astonished that Elizabeth could make a call, especially since their house had just gotten a phone installed. Nevertheless, the Fritzl family did not question anything further and accepted the baby, named Monica, born February 1994. 3 years later, in July 1997, another baby, this time a boy named Alexander, appeared on the Fritzls' doorstep. As before, Joseph and Rosemarie accepted the child without complaint and continued raising him. Thus, the 3 children, 2 girls and 1 boy, were officially taken in by the Fritzl family. They played and laughed daily, oblivious to the nightmarish existence of their mother and siblings trapped in the basement below. Meanwhile, Elizabeth remained underground with her 3 other children: Kirsten, her eldest; Stefan, her second child; and Felix, her youngest. These children had never seen sunlight. Their only connection to the outside world was a television, which Elizabeth used primarily to teach them to speak. Will Elizabeth and her children ever find a way to escape the darkness and return to a normal life? Or will they remain trapped in their perpetual nightmare, while Joseph, the monster masquerading as a father, evades justice for his unforgivable crimes against his daughter and their children, children who may not even know whether to call him father or grandfather? Stay tuned for the final chapter of the case. Living in a dark basement for 24 years without ever seeing sunlight, a number Joseph could have stretched to 34 years, 44 years, or even longer, is unimaginable. However, in 2008, something unexpected happened. A dreadful illness or a chance to escape the darkness. On April 19th, 2008, Kirsten, Elizabeth's 19-year-old daughter, suddenly fell gravely ill and was in a life-threatening condition. Elizabeth knelt and begged Joseph to allow Kirsten to be taken to the hospital. Joseph, albeit reluctantly, agreed. As usual, he fabricated a story that Elizabeth had written a letter explaining Kirsten's illness and pleading for help. Kirsten was rushed to the hospital unconscious, suffering from brain hypoxia. During treatment, doctors discovered she had a rare genetic condition that occurs only in children born from incestuous parents. Despite their efforts, the doctors couldn't pinpoint the cause of her illness and requested that her mother be brought to the hospital. However, no one knew where Elizabeth was, and Joseph, of course, remained silent. When doctors questioned Joseph about Kirsten during an examination, he stammered and presented a letter allegedly written by Elizabeth detailing Kirsten's condition. Joseph handed over Kirsten to the doctors and left. Sensing something amiss from Joseph's words and behavior, the doctors reported their concerns to the police. When officers arrived at the hospital, they found Kirsten without a legal guardian and tried to question her directly about her family background. However, Kirsten couldn't provide any information because she herself had no clear understanding of her own family. The hospitals report that Kirsten suffered from a condition caused by incestuous parentage, coupled with Yosef's evasive responses about her illness and circumstances, raised suspicions. Police began reinvestigating Elizabeth Fritzl's 24-year-long disappearance. A week later, on April 26, 2008, Elizabeth suddenly appeared at the hospital to visit Kirsten. The hospital staff, taken aback by her arrival, immediately notified the police. Officers rushed to the hospital and requested Elizabeth's cooperation in their investigation. She was temporarily detained for questioning regarding Kirsten's condition and the identity of her father. At first, Elizabeth refused to cooperate. She told the police, "No one will believe me if I tell them everything that has happened. No one will believe my words." After some hesitation, Elizabeth made one demand. Yosef must never be allowed to meet her or her children again. When the police agreed to this condition and assured her safety, Elizabeth finally recounted the harrowing story of her more than 20 years of captivity. Her revelations left everyone present horrified. The time had come for the monster to pay. Once Elizabeth disclosed everything, Yosef Fritzl was immediately arrested on April 27, 2008. After being detained for one day, Yosef confessed to the authorities, admitting to his heinous crimes against his daughter and revealing the secret underground basement beneath his house. This revelation quickly spread across Austria and the world, sparking outrage at the monster in human guise. When police searched the basement, they discovered its entrance concealed behind a shelving unit. The door was secured with a code lock and operated remotely. Inside, the basement, standing only 1.7 meters high, consisted of 4 small windowless rooms, ventilated by a pipe and a fan. An investigator described it as clearly a meticulously designed prison. Police also found scattered pieces of paper hidden in the basement, along with a diary believed to belong to Elizabeth. It detailed the dates and times of her father's abuse, including instances of beatings, threats, and even outbursts where he shattered plates in anger. The diary also recorded how Elizabeth had caught rats with her bare hands and how Yosef mocked the children in the basement by showing them photos of their siblings playing in the garden or swimming in a pool. Elizabeth documented every one of the 8,624 days she had been held captive and the more than 3,000 instances of sexual assault, writing with heart-wrenching detail. Yosef Fritzl's trial began on March 16, 2009, at the courthouse in St. Pölten, Austria. After 3 days of proceedings, the final verdict was delivered. The perpetrator, Yosef Fritzl, was sentenced to life imprisonment for the charges of murder of a newborn child, incest, unlawful imprisonment, and rape of his biological daughter. Yosef admitted to his crimes and declared he would not appeal the verdict. However, due to certain loopholes in Austrian law, Yosef Fritzl could potentially be released after serving only 15 years of his sentence, beginning in 2008. Specifically, if he demonstrated positive responses to psychological treatment and good behavior during his imprisonment, he might be granted clemency in 2023. As of now, no official decision has been made regarding whether Yosef Fritzl will be granted clemency. However, the possibility of his freedom is undoubtedly something no one wishes to see. Rosemarie, Joseph's wife, reportedly left immediately after Elizabeth was freed. Many speculate that she was so shocked by the cruel truth of her husband's actions against their daughter that she changed her name and relocated to another city. As for the once tragic daughter, Elizabeth, now 56 years old, she has assumed a new identity and lives with her 6 children in a new location. Her house is equipped with surveillance cameras, and police regularly patrol the area to ensure her safety. These measures are all intended to help her leave behind the nightmares and horrors of her past, allowing her to live a new life.